Like all literary movements, Romanticism eventually passes out of fashion. And part of that is because things are getting tougher in the real world. And science is getting more dominant. And Romanticism, as you know from looking at Romantic poetry, has that habit of overdoing everything. So in order to write these emotional stories, again, they wrote an awful lot of bad stories, and they wrote an awful lot of bad poems, and they always went overboard. And so that alienated a whole lot of writers. The education is going up, and the realists, again, part of it is that impetus that the next generation of writers have to discredit the way that stories were written by the older generation so they can write a new kind of story and they can replace them. So you have to deny most of the basic premises. And so what you have is where the emotions dominated Romanticism, the intellect, of course, dominates realism. And when the intellect comes back, first of all, it's anti-romantic. They don't like the fact that Romanticism plainly makes stuff up and doesn't have any qualms at all about making stuff up. To the Romantic, the story is supposed to illustrate a moral principle or stir up the emotions. It's not supposed to be a newspaper account. It's not supposed to be factual. It's supposed to be symbolic. The realistic writer said that's not what writers are here for. What good does it do to give people all of these ideals that don't exist in the real world? People aren't necessarily heroic. Sometimes they do things. Now when we get to naturalists, you'll see they believe that nobody is heroic ever, because nobody has any control over anything. But the realists were still willing to accept that people could sometimes act heroically. But when you keep telling everybody that there's going to be true love and that they are heroes, people end up being disappointed with what their life is, and they're never satisfied with it. As far as the realists were concerned, by creating these ideal figures that didn't exist in real life, they were giving people things to live up to which they couldn't possibly live up to. So all they were doing was spreading a false, as far as the realists are concerned, vision of the world to people that people then tried to live in terms of. And all that did, as far as they were concerned, was cause disaster. Instead, and the more realism starts to gain ground, the truer this is, the more scientific it becomes. So that the realists, many of them, saw themselves as scientists. And where the romantics had seen their stories as parables to illustrate a moral point, the realists saw their stories as ways of giving evidence to support a fact about human nature. So that when you were finished reading their stories, you were supposed to say, yes, that's the way it really is. That's the way people really are. Those characters are typical people. If you put those people in those circumstances, yes, that's what would happen. In other words, the stories were a kind of demonstration experiment. A demonstration experiment is one that's merely meant to illustrate one of the laws of nature. I might have mentioned this before. The chemistry teacher gets acid, and he gets the litmus paper, and he gets a little beaker of a base, and he puts the litmus paper in the acid, and it turns from blue to pink, or whichever way it is it turns, and then he puts it in the base, and it turns back again. Does he expect to discover anything when he does this? No. All he's trying to show you is the difference between acids and bases and how they react with one another. He's simply demonstrating a fact about nature. And that's what the realists thought that they were doing. So the first thing that they felt that a writer had to be was a keen observer. Remember, the Romantics said a writer's got to be somebody who feels keenly. If he feels keenly, he can stir up other people's emotions. He has to have a special fine sense of sensibilities. The realist said exactly the opposite of that. He shouldn't have any emotions at all. He should be simply looking at what goes on, and he should be factually recording it. His own personal feelings and his own prejudices shouldn't enter into the story at all. He should simply describe what it is that he sees. He should be an aloof observer. He shouldn't be emotionally involved. In fact, he shouldn't be involved in any way. He should be outside of the action. And that, of course, is one of the things that leads him to write so often in the third person. You have the narrator, who is usually a disembodied voice, the voice of reason, telling us what the world is like. This is what was observed. This is what the setting was. This is what the people said. This is what the people did. You notice when you look at Hills Like White Elephants that there's no authorial comment. The author doesn't tell you how he felt when those characters said something. Does he tell you how they felt? How the characters felt? No. Nowhere in there does he tell you anything about what's going on inside them. And he can't. If he's going to stand outside as an observer, he can't know what's going on in people's minds. He can tell you that they scowled. He can tell you that their head drooped. But he can't tell you what they felt. As an external observer in the factual world, nobody can read anybody else's mind. So the author can't go into the characters. He can't tell you what they were feeling. He can't even tell you what they were thinking. All he can tell you is what they said and what they did. Just the facts. And that's pretty much what you get. To the realist, remember, the physical world is the real world. They sided with Aristotle. The Romantics, they sided with Plato. The world is a symbolic expression of a cosmic world. But for the Romantics, for the realists, the real world is the physical world. And that's the only world. There's no supernatural forces showing through this world. There are forces at work in the world, but they're not moral forces. There's biological forces, and there's economic forces, and a lot of the forces that we'll see naturalism think play so important a role in the world, but they're not supernatural and they're not moral. People behave according to a set of natural laws. There are laws of human nature. The realistic writers thought they could discover those laws. They thought if you observed people, and watched what they did and watched what they said, you could come to conclusions in general about humanity. And that was what you were supposed to come up with. Not insights into the supernatural world and how every event had something to do with good and evil. Just how it is that people work. What are people really like? The idea then is to create a one-to-one correspondence between the actual event and its literary representation. They were looking for what they called a slice of life. They wanted the author to simply say and simply describe what it was that they saw. These are what these people looked like. This is what they said. This is what they did. Stand outside that and aloof from that, and simply accurately describe it in such a way that you say, yes, I've seen people like that. Yes, I believe that's what people are like. Truth is verifiable by experience. That is, the author shows a particular character in a particular place at a particular time, and they do something. And if what they do is true, we look at it and we say, yes, that's just what people do. Hills Like White Elephants, what's the problem there? What's that story all about?
Her being pregnant.
Her being pregnant, whether they're going to get an abortion or not. Well, there's specific action, verifiable consequence. You have young people traveling around on a kind of perpetual vacation. They have stickers on their suitcases from all the hotels where they've stayed overnight. Why does he emphasize overnight? Because that's where the sex is going to happen. So you have people sleeping together all the time in an age with not much birth control. What's likely to happen?
Yeah, baby.
She's going to get pregnant. So we look at that story and we say, yeah, that's exactly what would happen. Young people traveling around, having a good time, sleeping together every night. She's bound to get pregnant. There's not much in the way of reliable birth control. We look at the specific action, we say, yes, that's the probable consequence. When we look at the characters, she's apparently told him she was pregnant. What was his response? Was he overjoyed?
No.
If that were a romantic story,
He would be.
he would say, that's great. I wanted to get married all along, and now we have the perfect reason for it. A child that we can bring up. Isn't this wonderful? Most young guys, their girlfriends tell them they're pregnant. What's their response? How wonderful? That's great. Now we can get married.
Horrible.
They're horrified. If they can force that weak smile, that's the best you could possibly hope for. Oh. They're not happy about it. So when he's not happy, we look at it and say, yeah, if in the real world your girlfriend tells you she's pregnant, you're not overjoyed. They've been having a good time. That's what it's all about. So it's truthful because we look at it and say, yes, that's the way people typically react. It's what they call a slice of life. It's not supposed to be a long series of events where all the loose ends gets tied up. It's kind of a verbal snapshot of humanity, just at one brief point in time. And because of that, you don't have any ending where all the loose ends get tied up. I mean, a snapshot may tell you a lot about the circumstances and what went on in the event that you took the picture of, but it's not a video. It doesn't go on to a whole series of actions and eventually tell you how it came out and what it all meant. Instead, the writer's just supposed to take this little picture of the world. That's why if you look at that story, we don't see the scene, we don't see them traveling around, we don't see them sleeping together, we don't see her telling him that she's pregnant. It starts out right in the middle. They're at a place where they're going to make a decision. They're at a crossroads. They're at that place where the train comes in for Barcelona. And they're either getting on it, having the abortion, or they're not. We don't know yet. Do we find out at the end of the story? No. It chops right off because it's only a photograph. It's not a movie. Next week we'll finish up Realism. We'll start looking more closely at Hills Like White Elephants and The Sun Also Rises. The quiz will be on Realism from that Realism sample test. If you didn't get the handouts for Naturalism, make sure you get them before you leave.